Which mistakes are stopping you from painting better miniatures? Well, in the past few days, over 100 painters applied to have their miniatures reviewed by me on this channel. And as you'll see, many of them share the same mistakes that all painters make. And I'm gonna share some tricks that'll help you avoid them going forward. Now, if you wanna apply for the next miniature review, there is a link in the description. Just enter your email and I'll send you the form. This is the first miniature and isn't that lovely. But unfortunately, I can't really use it. Now, of course, I could just stop the video and take a screenshot or something, but the problem is that it is lit just from the left. Now, don't you worry, I actually found a way to work around it, so this miniature can be reviewed, but you wouldn't believe how many photos I got that are straight up unusable. So just for future reference, there is a guide on how to take a proper photo in the sign up form. Anyway, I found a better photo of this guy and that's so much better. Pretty much everything on this mini is made from metal, so let's talk about non-metallic metal. To paint a credible non-metallic metal, you gotta do 3 things, and one of them is sort of optional. So those are high contrast, which means a big difference between light and shadows. You also need a good reflection placement, and if the metal is really reflective and shiny, then there is gonna be light from the environment, sort of bounce light and secondary reflections. And if you got those 3 things right, you're set. I think that many things on this miniature are correct, but also many things that could be improved, so let me show you the first edit I made. The most obvious change is the shoulder pad right here. Instead of having the reflection all the way up here, it makes sense to put it more in the front. This is because shiny surfaces reflect the light towards the viewer's eye, and not directly up from the light source. So that just means that whenever you paint anything reflective, you should consider the main viewing angle and place the reflections accordingly. If you really struggle with reflection placement, it's useful to take a photo of your miniature in a black primer and copy the reflections like that, especially the shiny materials. Of course, you can also use other references. Actually, I have a dedicated video on that, so there will be a link in the description. But coming back to the shoulder pad, you can see that even other plates around it reflect the light the same way. And that's because all of these sections are exposed in the same angle. And when you really think about it, this entire reflection kinda copies the shape of a cylinder. And it turns out that many features on our miniatures are just modified cylinders. Even the other shoulder pad kinda works like that, it's just that the angle is different. Aside from the reflection placement, I also made the helmet a bit brighter, made it a bit cleaner, and also added some edge highlights on the face mask, as you can see. And of course, this is important because you want the face and the helmet to stand out as the focal point of your miniature. Now, of course, if you decide to not make it as smooth, that's completely fine. For example, on the belly, I didn't smooth it out or anything. It kind of makes sense for it to be a bit rough or textured because, of course, this guy probably fights all the time. Of course, the armor doesn't have to be super smooth, but the texture that you paint should be intentional. There is also this steel arm guard, and it had like no reflection painted, so I added it. Again, if you took a black primer reference photo, you would have found it for sure. In the second edit, I sketched some secondary reflections. If you're not painting a super reflective non-metallic metal, you can skip it for sure, but I think it makes it way more interesting. So on the belly armor, there is another reflection at the bottom, which kinda simulates the bounce light from the environment, and it's always separated by a shadow from the main reflection. So the pattern is, there is the main reflection, then there is the shadow separating the other reflection, and finally, you have your secondary reflection. And the same thing was done for the helmet. So you can compare the before and after and see for yourself which version do you like more. Now, I've also done a third edit where I paint over the cleaver. Honestly, whenever you're painting something that's flat and has no volume, it's very tricky to paint and quite problematic, because since there is no volume, multiple reflection placements are possible. So in this case, I would do something like this, but just a tip for you, if you are practicing painting non-metallic metal for the first time, pick something that has volume, like a round helmet or a glove or something like that. If I had this miniature in hand, I would most likely try multiple light placements on the cleaver, and eventually I would find the one which I'm happy with. So just keep in mind that I am not too happy with this one either. Even the original placement is not exactly wrong. It's just that for something that's supposed to be reflective, this transition is kinda too gradual and not sharp enough. But if it's not supposed to be too reflective, I think it might work. The photo of this miniature is really not great. It's quite overexposed and the background is really distracting. And going forward, we really won't be reviewing photos like this because it might look entirely different in real life. But in this case, I made an exception because this is the first miniature that this person painted. So let's remove the background, and already with a neutral gray, it's so much better. And let's talk about how to improve it. Of course, a lot can be said about this mini, but keep in mind that this is the first finished model. So I want to make it very actionable for you without making it overwhelming and nitpicking every single detail. First of all, the entire model needs to be cleaner. So when you look at my first edit, you can see that all these little sections on the armor are now less patchy. And overall, there is less spillover. On top of that, I also recess shaded everything, and that makes the model more easily readable and much more defined. On the other hand, when you remove it, you can kinda see that certain spots are a bit dirty and there is a bit of a glossy finish. And this might have happened because you are using washes and maybe you haven't shaken the paint bottle enough. And this is exactly the reason why I don't like using washes at all. It's supposed to shade your model fast, but you clearly don't have a great control over the result. The only kind of wash that I use is an oil wash, but only for army painting. When I paint for quality, you can do everything manually, and it'll look way better. So by recess shading everything on this miniature, you make it much more readable, and therefore you push it a bit further. And then I added some highlights and details. When you look at the eyes, I painted that really wasn't there before. I made the muscles much lighter, and I just added edge highlights over the entire piece. And for example, the face certainly deserves way more light because it's the focal point of this miniature. So by adding light to certain parts and adding edge highlights on top, you are making everything even more defined and more readable. When you think about it, this is similar to the way that GW paints their box art. For the most part, it's just recess shading and highlights. And now you can see why it's so effective. Again, we could talk about other stuff as well, like color theory or atmosphere or whatnot, but I genuinely think that you'll get the best bang for your buck by doing this specifically. Just look at this comparison. This miniature is really nice, but we can add some tweaks to make it truly outstanding. First up, let's talk about this gold. Again, just like I mentioned with the first miniature, reflective materials are more sensitive to the main viewing angle compared to the matte materials. Even in this case, we should push the reflection downward, because that's exactly how metals behave. They bounce the light directly towards the viewer. If you don't believe me, just take a metal object and put it under a lamp to see for yourself. As long as the object is below the lamp and not behind it, the reflection will be in the front. And aside from moving the reflections, I also added some secondary ones. And together, by moving certain reflections and including more subtle ones, I think the result is way more credible when you compare it to the original. Especially on this little skull. Now, if you think that my gold in this case is a bit too greenish, that's not a problem at all. Just pick a color recipe that you like and roll with it. My own preferred recipe is Rhinox Hide, British Khaki, Japanese Brown, Purulent Yellow, and finally, White. And of course, there are some intermediate tones mixed in between those. What I really like about the armor are those nice volumetric highlights you painted on the knee or even the helmet, but it could be more prominent. I added even more volumetric highlights on the shoulder pads, the backpack and the helmet to pull the viewer's attention here. On top of that, to get better readability, I would paint some edge highlights around the face mask. I highlight all the edges, even the bottom ones, It's just that the more exposed edges will be lighter and the less exposed edges will be darker. Some people will tell you that the bottom edges shouldn't be touched at all, but I genuinely think that it improves the definition and readability. You already do have a nice definition and readability on your piece, so this will elevate it even further. Now the third part that I'm gonna talk about is the gun. As it is, the black frame is not dark enough. In fact, it looks just as reflective as the metal part. I would suggest making it darker and making the steel parts lighter. Of course, not all non-metallic metal has to be super reflective, but whenever you are painting anything, it's a good idea to go into the extremes, so it's pretty clear what you're trying to portray. Aside from making the reflections brighter, I also moved them a bit, so now it makes more sense, and that's exactly the same thing that we said when we adjusted the gold. And one thing I want to point out is that this cylinder right here and this steel part right here essentially have the same reflection placement. And that's because the top part essentially is the same shape. And since the shape is the same, so is the reflection placement. Take from this what you will. Personally, I think you're doing great, and if you implement these changes, it'll be truly outstanding. On this photo, I can't really zoom in properly to see what is going on without losing the image quality. But again, there is another photo of this miniature on this painter's profile, so let's roll with that. This is quite an overwhelming piece, and it would take me hours to change everything that I would like. So I made some selective changes and you can apply them for the rest. First up, cleanliness. When you look at various parts, they seem to be a bit messy. Like this red badge has a bit of a glossy finish, most likely from a wash. I can't really tell what is going on the black part, and even the golden bits seem to have a grainy finish. It's not really that frequent that metallic paint will cause grainy finish on the surface, so I think that this happened when priming. There are two possibilities. One, you didn't shake the primer well enough, or two, you oversprayed a bit. Rattle cans have acetone in them, which should evaporate quickly, but sometimes it doesn't, and it kinda melts the plastic surface. And then this happens. So when I'm army painting, I do prefer rattle cans because it's more durable. But for display level pieces, I only use my airbrush because it's more safe. So anyway, to fix the glossiness, you can do a very simple thing. Just simply paint over this part and just leave a very small black line around that metal skull. Of course, you can do this everywhere. For example, I did the same thing on the cloth, but generally speaking, instead of using washes, you can shade your miniature manually. So even when it comes to this skull right here, instead of using any kind of wash, you can take a really dark paint and just blackline it with your brush without applying any wash whatsoever. A similar treatment goes for the black armor. I am not even sure whether this reflection right here is painted, but to make it nice and clean, you gotta build full opacity with your layers. And in the end, you'll get much less patchy result. Also, if you want more precise edge highlights like this, you should use a paint consistency that's easy to spread, but also you should wick off the excess, because you don't want too much paint in the bristles. We can also fix the patchy result on the face by building up full opacity with each of the layers that we apply. And just look how I put the lightest color at the most exposed parts of the face, like the upper cheek or the forehead. Now, one thing that's kinda optional and that many Warhammer miniatures don't even have are the eyebrows. A simple line could work. It will most likely require some back and forth, but I think it's worth it. Overall, it just creates a better impression. I also wanted to mention that if you switch to painting non-metallic metal, you can be much more intentional with your reflection placement. But in your case, for now, I would focus on being more neat and precise and getting cleaner result by building full opacity with your layers and relying less on washes. So keep on painting. Overall, you are heading in the right direction. Still, learning non-metallic metal is very useful because you'll learn about reflection placement, about cleanliness, but with you specifically, I will tackle it maybe in the future. Remember, if you want to sign up to have your miniature reviewed, there will be a link in the description. By signing up, you'll also get extra miniature painting tips, so check it out. And see you in the next one.